Okay, well, hi everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in and choosing to spend the next hour with us for our webinar, Don't Hate, Automate, the Fundamentals of Automations. So my name is Holly Coxon and I'm a technical support team lead for the FME Server product. And today I'm joined by Sinai, who I'll let introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name's Sinai. I'm a technical support specialist on the FME Server team. Excited to be here.
And we are also joined by Kezia behind the scenes, who is another member of our FME Server support team on hand to aid with the Q&A panel today. So I think at this time, we're just going to turn off our videos so that there's no lag. And we'll turn these back on for the live Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Okay, so before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce the entire FME platform to make sure that we are all on the same page. So first of all, we have our FME Desktop application, and this is really the foundation of the FME platform. It is where all the authoring of transformation workflows takes place. And as the name suggests, this application is accessible on your local desktop and is a graphical drag and drop interface where you can connect readers, writers, and transformers to load, manipulate, and analyze data, and so much more. And then we have our FME Server application, and this takes these transformation workflows and allows you to incorporate them into more complex integration tasks. For example, creating self-service applications where the end user can upload or download data, chaining multiple workspaces to run in parallel or in sequence, or setting up workspaces to run in response to an event happening on another application, or taking further downstream actions once a workspace has completed successfully. So then FME Cloud is FME Server, but hosted by Saved Software. So you get the same functionality, but with less overall maintenance. And finally, we have our FME Mobile application, but we won't really be touching on that today. So today we'll be walking through the fundamentals of automations, and this functionality is available to FME Server, hosted both on-premise or by FME Cloud. So now that I've provided a brief overview of the platform, I just wanted to take a quick poll to gauge everyone's experience with the FME platform. And if you feel like you don't fit nicely into any of these topics, then please leave a comment through the questions panel as well. So we'll just give a moment or so to complete that poll, and then we'll check out the results.
Okay, and it looks like the majority of people have voted, so I will go ahead and close that poll and share the results in a minute here.
Great. Okay, perfect. So we have a whole host of different experience with the FME platform today. So if you did answer D, then I suspect you are already familiar with a lot of the content that we will be covering in today's session. But of course, we still encourage you to stick around. Okay, let's dive into it. So we're going to start by walking you through why you should care about enterprise integration and how this can be applied in the context of FME Server by making use of automations. So automations is a fairly new feature, but it has a long history. So before we dive into the specifics, we'd like to start by providing some extra background information on where this feature started. Next, we'll be breaking down automations into its individual components and go through everything you need to know to get started. That's not a typo, that's our first pizza-related pun of the session. And then before we wrap up, we'll briefly touch on some advanced functionality, share some resources, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end for a Q&A session as well. But don't forget to please ask any questions that you have throughout. As I mentioned, we'll have Kezia on Q&A, and Sinai and I will also be monitoring this panel when we can as well. So firstly, why should your organization care about adding automated elements into their workloads? Well, there are many advantages to automation that make it a necessity to scale your business to meet growing demands. First of all, it's a huge time saver. This point is really twofold, as not only does it scratch off a task from your personal workload, giving you back time in your day, but in general, adding in automation increases efficiency and productivity, so any tasks will likely be completed in a quicker time frame than they were previously as well. Standardizing processes also alleviates the possibility of introducing human error and makes projects easier to scale up. And then on top of all this, your organization will likely be saving money and improving the experience for the end user. So if you are interested in reading a bit more about automation for the enterprise, then I'll ask Elizabeth to just share out the blog post that is linked on this slide, where we have highlighted some stories from customers who have benefited from one or many of these points. So FME Server is the tool for all things automation, and this is where we'll be focusing our presentation today. So the key functionality that's also rightfully named automations provides a visual drag and drop interface, much like that of FME Desktop, that allows you to build workflows to initiate workspaces to run in response to various events. So for the sake of this webinar, we are assuming that you may have worked with FME Desktop before and that you've created a couple of workspaces, and now you're wondering how to set them up either at a recurring interval or in response to an external event. Perhaps you want them to be run in real time, or perhaps you're looking to chain a series of workspaces together to run either in sequence or in parallel. And if the answer to any of these is yes, then this is where FME Server Automations comes into play. So automations have a long history, and we can actually date the foundations back to 10 years ago in FME Server 2012. So in 2012, a brand new concept was developed for FME Server under the name notifications. And this was the first real-time support for processing workspaces. At that time, we were able to work with email, JMS, and UDP, just to name a few. Over the years, the team worked hard to continually add support for more protocols so that workspaces could be initiated in response to many different events. For example, adding a file to a Dropbox or an S3 bucket, monitoring a WebSocket. However, the notifications configuration was not exactly user-friendly, so you were required to set up 3 different steps across 3 pages of the FME Server web interface, and then these were all presented in a list view, so it was challenging to figure out how everything was connected. So this is where the idea for automations really came from. To give you the best experience possible, we took the selling points from FME Workbench and applied them to this feature. So in 2019, we released this brand new interface, providing a visually appetizing graphical canvas where you could connect related nodes. The aim was to enhance the user experience by building off of the existing notifications functionality. And since then, we've continued to add support for even more advanced enterprise integration workflows. So it's important to be aware of this history because although notifications is now considered legacy functionality, it does remain in the product for backwards compatibility. So if you come across this either in the product or in our knowledge base materials, then don't be confused, but stick to using automations for all of your job orchestration tasks. So now I'm going to hand over to Sinai to walk you through the fundamentals of automations.
Thanks, Holly. So now that we've arrived at present day automations, let's start talking about the fundamentals or the need to know. And to help us do that, we're going to talk about pizza. So stay with us. Let's imagine that the FME lizard has a craving for pizza. So he calls up the restaurant and places an order. Zipster Pizza receives this order, assembles the ingredients, makes the pizza, and finally delivers the pizza to the lizard. The best possible end result is the lizard enjoying the pizza at home. But any step of the way, we can run into issues. And I'm sure at this point, some of you might be checking what webinar you signed up for here. So I'll explain. This pizza story is meant to represent how automations work in FME Server. So in technical terms, the FME lizard is the client that makes a request from the Zipster restaurant, which is the FME Server automation. The ingredients, baking, and delivery are the data and processes that take place inside of an automation. We're going to use this pizza story analogy as we walk through each basic automation component. And we will begin with the client. So our first step in any pizza story is the client. And in this case, there is a lizard who wants to order and receive a pizza. They could technically send this pizza to another client, maybe a friend or a work party. But either way, there's going to be a client on either end of this workflow sending and receiving information. And all automation workflows are initiated by a client. So this is usually a request or an event performed by an end user. So that could be a row update in a database, a file uploaded to a folder, or maybe an email is being sent. Clients can look also a little bit more like applications or systems. So this could be a sensor or satellite that's monitoring or observing something, sending messages about certain events. Either way, automated workflows aren't random. They're always initiated by some event that we're interested in. And any outputs or messages can also be returned to a client, either the same one or a different one. And a trigger is what we use in an automation to receive messages about these events. So I'm sad to say that we can't just manifest pizza. We need to find a way to let the restaurant know that we want a pizza. So we could phone them, use a web form, text them, maybe use a delivery service like Uber Eats or Skip the Dishes. It's all going to go to the same restaurant. And just the same, automations can't read minds yet. FME Server can receive messages from clients in many different ways, however, and this will initiate a workflow. And inside of our automations, we can set up triggers to listen for messages and events coming from clients. The different ways of ordering pizza are all representing different protocols in client-server communication, and protocols are just ways that applications can send messages to each other. And each event, trigger event type represent a different protocol that a client can use to make this request. Here are some of the many different protocols that triggers support, and there are more. So we have cloud services, different types of directories, webhooks, JMS, SQS schedules. So say we want to begin a workflow. Every time we get a new email to our Outlook inbox, we choose the email trigger. And the best part about this is we don't need to know the ins and outs of IMAP protocol. I definitely don't still. All we have to know is our basic account information that we'd use to log in to our email in the browser, and we enter that into the trigger. This is a lot like how readers work in FME Workbench. We just add the data to our canvas, and readers make any data set easy to work with, no matter how complex that format actually is. And once our automation is running, triggers are always in an active state. They're listening for messages related to these events for you. They're basically a 24/7, 365 restaurant ready to make pizza at the drop of a hat. So let's get into Server and set up a trigger for the first time. So here we are on the FME Server homepage, and on our side menu are all the things that we can do as a user. Under automations, we have a couple of options, and one of them you might notice is the notifications tab, which is the legacy system that Holly touched on earlier. Unless you're curious about this or already using it, just ignore it. The place we always begin for a new automation is the build automation page. And now that we've arrived here, if you're familiar with FME Workbench, you'll be familiar with this idea of a canvas. This is the space where we can build our automation workflows. It's also a drag and drop interface where we can connect workflow components together. And just like we begin our desktop workflows with a reader or creator, we can begin our automation workflows with a trigger. And as we now know, these triggers can be configured for many different types of protocols, which we find in this menu. And many you'll recognize from our protocol slide. For our example, let's use our trusty directory watch trigger. This one gets used a lot. And once we select it, we can configure parameters to look for certain events. So in this case, we want to choose a folder to watch. And watch triggers can connect to folders on the same system, on a network path, or on some hosted service. But in this case, we're just going to use a folder on our server share. We have other options we can configure. We just want to look for new files incoming. So I'll deselect modified and deleted files. And then we want a very short poll interval here, so we don't have all day. After setting up settings, I can validate it to make sure server is able to access it, and then I just select apply. It's as easy as that. And for this part of the demo, we want to just make sure that our trigger is working. So what I'm going to do is add a log action to our canvas. Like the Workbench logger, we can record messages inside the automation. We'll talk more about these messages later. For now, I just want to send some event data from our directory watch trigger. So I'll set up the message to do that. And then I'll save this automation. And once I hit start, this automation is now running, and we can drop a file into the directory that we've set it up to watch. So I'll go to that directory. And in this case, I'm going to drop in a zip file containing a shapefile and its sidecar files. So now that this file is dropped into our directory, we can go back to our automation. And our trigger should receive events for each file that's created in that folder. And our logger will record information sent about that event. Okay, awesome. Here we can see that our trigger has successfully gone off and our logger has recorded the message. In this message here, it's the raw message, so we can get our zip file name out of there and path, the time of creation, and any other data about that event that we might be interested in. Now we can take this information and use it to kick off an automated workflow. So let's return back to our slides and figure out what steps we can do next, besides just logging a message. So actions represent any steps that we take after a trigger is fired. And in this point in our pizza story, the restaurant has received our order. Now it's time for the kitchen to make the pizza, and then a driver takes that pizza and delivers it to our door. And this conveniently also describes two categories of actions that we can use in automations. When an event is sent to our trigger, we can perform actions either within FME Server or external to FME Server. So starting with what we can do inside of a kitchen, this would be things like slicing pepperoni, kneading dough, putting it in the oven. We're creating the product here. And internal actions are what we use inside of an automation to process data and messages just like this. Primarily, we're going to be using the run workspace a lot of the time, the run workspace action, that is. So we can build workspaces in desktop, upload them to FME Server, and in FME Server, we can use them to run data transformations within our automated workflows. So within that workspace, you can take that data and do anything you'd like with it. Other internal actions are things like the merge or filter action. These are useful for orchestrating just how these automated workflows are run and any decision-making that we'd like to build in. After the pizza is ready, we need to deliver it. So this would be a driver using a car, a bike, walking, any way to bring the pizza to your front door. And many of the same protocols that we use to receive event data from clients, we can also use to deliver data back to our clients. And we can configure these external actions very similarly to trigger events. We just add in our basic information, and the automation will be connected to an external client. External actions are the best way to integrate and connect with other applications. So this might look like sending a notification out upon delivery or failure of a job, uploading data to a file share. This part of the workflow is entirely up to you. And here's another summary page just of all the available protocols for internal and external actions. You can compare all of the actions in this slide to transformers that you might use in Workbench. So for example, you might use a filter transform or a filter action, and that acts a lot like a tester transformer that you'd use on desktop. Or sometimes external actions can also look more like a writer. So if you're uploading data somewhere, that could look like writing out a file. This analogy kind of extends between the two platforms. The distinction between desktop and server actions can become even more blurred when you consider that a lot of these protocols have an equivalent transformer in FME Desktop. So the FTP action is a lot like an FTP caller. We also have a Dropbox connector transformer, S3 connector, and we have a Dropbox external action and S3 external action, as well as emailer. But there are advantages to using external actions instead of Workspace transformer. For one, actions aren't going to take up engines, so they're lighter on your system resources. I'd also say that breaking up the workflow into these defined sections is often just considered a best practice. It's easier to organize a workflow, troubleshoot, and build in the logic all in one place. So let's jump back into our demo and see what it looks like to use actions. So we first need to stop an automation in order to edit it. And I'm going to click on our log action here, and we'd like to switch it to run a workspace action. And this particular workspace that I've uploaded to server is called building updates, and it's just designed to update a feature service in ArcGIS Online with incoming features. So we have one parameter for it, and all I'm going to do here is enter the path to our newly dropped zip file detected by our directory watch trigger and select apply. You might notice that workspaces are another way that we can communicate with external clients from an automation that aren't necessarily listed in those protocols. So in this case, we are sending updates to ArcGIS Online. So when you consider all of the transformers, web connections, readers, and writers available to us on desktop, the number of external clients that we can communicate from an automation is practically infinite. So technically with workspaces, we're not even limited to these external actions. We can access everything from Workbench from within our automation. But external actions are very useful nonetheless. So in this case, what if we wanted to send ourselves a notification for every update that we make to our feature service? One way we could do this is with an email external action. So if I select send an email, we have a template for setting that up. So if I'm using Outlook or Gmail, we also have template values to enter in here to make it even easier. All I'd have to do is enter my email address, password, as well as what I want to include in this email. But to save us time, I've actually already set up an automation with that email trigger set up. So we can go look at that. And I've even entered a little HTML formatted body here to contain information about our updates being sent from this directory to ArcGIS Online. I can validate it to make sure that it's still good. FME Server can connect to our inbox. I'll select apply. And once I start this automation, we can go back to our directory that we're watching and submit a new update. So I'm going to drop a new zip file containing a shapefile and its sidecar files. And we can pretty much assume that this file is going to get picked up right away with the very short polling interval that I've set up on our directory watch every 2 seconds. So I can head over to my inbox first and see if our notification worked, and it looks like it did. So here is our email notification that we set up in our FME Server Automation, just letting me know that a layer has been updated. And if I were to go over to our ArcGIS Online layer, we could probably see some new features that have been added here from our shapefile zip. So you can see, maybe you noticed before BC Place was missing, and now we have a new feature on our layer. And that was just added by that automation that we made in under a minute. So now we can see how we can use triggers, internal actions, and external actions to create a front-end workflow, connecting different applications, data, and formats together in an automated workflow. And keys are the last and final part of our need to know automations overview today, or at least the parts that I will be covering. Throughout our pizza story, a lot of communication has happened. An order was passed from the lizard to the restaurant. That order is then passed to the kitchen with the chefs. And then we have a driver that needs an address and payment information to deliver the final product. And in FME Server, we use keys to pass messages in between our automation components. So every trigger and action has its own properties that can be passed on to the next action. And triggers and actions also have parameters that can be set up to intake these key values. And the whole system is built on JSON format. So if you're familiar with JSON, this is going to be even more simple, but you don't have to know it in order to use keys. Once we connect a trigger and an action or two actions together on our automation canvas, keys are available to use in downstream parameters, and different actions will have different parameters. So if we use the run workspace action as an example, the parameters within that action may depend on the user parameters that were configured within the workspace. So for example, in our demo, we passed the directory watch file path into our run workspace action in order to use that shapefile in our workspace. Keys are definitely a topic worthy of more discussion time than we have today. So we've linked our webinar to automation keys on the bottom of this slide if you're interested in learning more about them. So this completes my part of the pizza story from client to server, back to client again. Now I'm going to pass it back to Holly to explain what happens when something goes wrong.
Great, thank you, Sanai. So that was an overview of all of the different components of automations and how they work with one another. But inevitably, when you're brand new to an application, or even if you've got a lot of experience, things can go wrong. So I wanted to walk you through some troubleshooting techniques before we conclude today's webinar. So what could go wrong? Well, when you're ordering a pizza, there are many things. Maybe you have a bad connection and your order doesn't go through, or an ingredient is out of stock, or you submitted the wrong information and they delivered your pizza to the wrong address, or maybe you received the wrong order, although in my experience, that's not always a bad thing because I have ended up with free pizza before. But the point is that something could go wrong at every single stage, and that applies to the automations workflow as well. It could be in a trigger or an action or something within the actual workspace translation. So to troubleshoot anything in FME, we have to turn to the log files. So you can think of the log files as the equivalent of the tracking feature when you place an online order. Every automation in FME Server has a log that records the complete history of every event that is taking place. This includes any incoming messages received by a protocol, how frequently a service is polled, any errors attempting to connect to a configuration, or carry out any specific task in the workflow. Using the automations log can help narrow down where you should focus your troubleshooting efforts and identify whether there is an issue with the automation or with a specific job. So when a workspace is run on FME Server, this is what we refer to as a job. And no matter how the job is submitted, whether it's with an automation or otherwise, it will generate a log file as well. And this log captures all the messages generated by the components of the specific translation. And this should be near identical to the translation logs generated when you created and tested running a workspace in FME Desktop. And I will point out that if you publish a workspace to FME Server without testing it, then go back and run it on FME Desktop first. So for the most part, automation and job log files should be descriptive enough for you to identify what went wrong when setting up an automation, but occasionally you might need to log further information to fully diagnose the issue. So in this case, the log action, which is an internal action, is particularly helpful for troubleshooting because it allows you to route specific keys or event messages to the automation log to help you understand how information is being stored and passed between nodes. So in FME Workbench, you may have come across the logger transformer, and the log action is the FME Server Automations equivalent. So depending on whether you're troubleshooting an error within a job or within an automation component, either one may come in handy. So I've been following along with Sinai and creating my own automation, but I didn't receive an email. So now we're going to take a few minutes to look in my automation, go through some of these log files and try and figure out where I went wrong. So here I have my FME server, and actually I'm just going to zoom in a bit, as I know on my larger monitor sometimes it can be small in a screen share. And I'm going to go to my most recent automation. So here I have my directory watch, my workspace, and then sending an email as well. And to access an automations log file, all I need to do is go to the menu and view log file. And here you can see, hopefully it's big enough, that we've logged every message from the assembly of the automation to polling the directory and to sending any events. So I already went through the process of uploading a zip file to the directory that I'm watching, and it looks like my job did submit successfully here. However, it looks like the translation ran into an error. So my log is very short because I'm just testing. However, if you do have an automation that's been running for some time, this log file may span over a series of pages. So in that case, you can use these filters at the top to filter out for any errors or warnings to help track down any issues. So in this case, because the issue was to do with a job, I'm actually going to go and take a look at the job log to see if there's any more information that can help me diagnose the issue. So I'm going to jump back to my automation. And in the menu again, this time I can see all the jobs that this automation has triggered. It simply applies a filter on the jobs completed page. So from here, I can see that my last workspace to run did fail. And if I go and check it out, I have exactly the same things as were available through the automations log. So I can filter out any errors. So in this case, it looks like there was only one error printed in the log, but it's always important to go and check that job log if there was a failure with the job, because it could hold more information than what the automation has to offer. So here it looks like the shapefile has failed to open file for reading. So this is curious because I would expect to see a full file path here. So perhaps there's an issue with the entry into my published parameter within my Workspace node on the canvas. So let's take a look back over to my automation and see what I've got set up here. So if I go and view my building updates, it looks like I set my shapefile to my file root name, and perhaps that's not the right key to use. But what I can do is I'm going to add a log action here, and I'm going to log all of the keys from the directory watch just to double check which one I should be using downstream. So I'm going to disable my workspace at this point because I don't want to run it when I know that it's going to fail. And then I'm going to update this to a log a message. And I'm going to log all of my keys from my directory. So my file action, my file path, and my file root name. And this will help me determine what information I should be passing downstream. So now I'm going to go and drop a file back into that directory again. And in a moment, we should see that this information has been logged. So I can view my complete log file here, and I can filter just for messages coming from the log action. And you can see here that I now have all three of my keys logged. So it looks like actually the key that I need to be using in this case is the full file path. So this is a fairly simple example, but just to demonstrate how you can make use of the log action to determine what information you're actually passing through to the remainder of your downstream actions. So now I can go back, remove my log action since I've determined the cause of the issue, update my workspace to use the file path instead, enable the workspace, and start it. And this time, if I were to trigger it again, let's see if I have some additional files that I can use. Let's see. I might have to remove one of these first and then reload it again. I didn't prepare any more zip files. So now what I can do is move this back into here. And this is because I'm only monitoring for create, which is why I need to remove it first. And we should see that this workspace will be triggered successfully and also run an email. Well, I'll also receive an email. And when you're doing a live demo, a few seconds always seems like a long time. There we go. So here you can see that my job was submitted. And this time my translation was successful. And I have received an email containing my updates. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of troubleshooting and the fundamentals to working with automations in FME Server. So we hope that you found this information valuable and are now thinking what else you need to know. I promise that's the last time that I'll use that pun. Automations has many advanced capabilities to enable you to orchestrate more complex enterprise integration tasks. So on this slide, I've just linked some resources that I'll ask Elizabeth to send out in the chat. And we're also just going to conduct another poll, as we'd love to hear from you what automations webinar you'd like us to cook up for you next.
All right, and we'll give everyone a few moments here to place their entries. Okay, maybe about 10 more seconds to get your poll response in. Okay, and it looks like the majority have voted now, so I'll close out the poll here.
Okay, well, so now it looks like we've got our work cut out for us, because we are doing at least 3 more webinars on automations.
Sounds like a series. I wonder what food we'll pick for our next analogy. Maybe we'll just keep talking about pizza.
Okay, so what we wanted to do was leave you with a couple of further resources, because the purpose of this webinar was really to explain the different components that make up automations. So we want to leave you with the tools to actually go away and be able to do this yourself as well. So here we've highlighted a chapter from our FME training platform, as well as an extensive tutorial series from our community. And these both contain step-by-step instructions for working with different triggers, as well as internal and external actions. So if this webinar sparked your interest, then we highly encourage you to go and check out these resources. So if you haven't already signed up for the FME Academy, then you will need to make an account to access that training material, but it is free. And you can also download FME Server today and use it with a free trial as well.
Thanks, Holly. So I would take over for a few minutes and then we can move on to our Q&A. We really appreciate if you do have time to share your experience with FME on Gartner Peer Insights. I will drop the link in the chat to contribute a review there. And also, as a thank you for joining us today, we do have a community badge that you can redeem. If you are not a part of the FME community, we highly encourage you to check that out. So we are 2 weeks away from our UC, and I know us Safer are all excited for that. There will be a lot of FME users there, so register if you have yet to do so. I will drop the link in the chat now. Lastly, please check out our upcoming and on-demand webinars on our website, safe.com/webinars. And we do have some time for Q&A if you haven't had a chance to drop in your question. Please do so in the question tab on the bottom right there and upvote any question that look relevant to you. And with that, I will pass it back to our presenters to host the Q&A. I think we have addressed all the question on the question tab, but going through the chat, I think we have like 2 questions.
Yeah. Great questions, everyone. Thanks for submitting those during the presentation. Always like to see what people are curious about. Yeah, so in the chat function, you're right. I think I saw a couple go by. They're a little harder to catch, but let's see. This is a really good one, actually, that I'd like to highlight. Ray is asking, can you set up an email message on fail? So that's a really good question because we hope everything goes right, but oftentimes it doesn't, especially when you're integrating lots of different applications and data sets and relying on different people and systems to have your workflows complete successfully. But if they don't, there's lots of ways that we can catch errors before they cause too many problems and fix them quickly. So one way, and probably the most common way that I would suggest doing this, is to utilize the fail port on your automation actions inside of your canvas. So looking back at when we were looking at the automation, adding an run workspace action to your automation, there's a port for a success, there's a port for a failure, and then if we add an automations writer, oftentimes there'll be a custom port underneath. We want to look at that failure port, and we can connect a next action to that. So the failure port is where all of the sort of rejected features or translation errors are going to output from. And we can collect those errors, and we can send ourselves a notification with the content of those errors. So that would be a really fast way to catch any features that are incorrect. Maybe a file is missing or has been deleted or moved. We can catch that as well on our triggers. So yeah, utilize that rejected port and the failed port on the run workspace action. There's also ways to do this in server, like the system events. You can alert yourself to failures that way. You don't need to use email. You can integrate, text messages and things like that. It's very customizable. We can also send entire log files as well if you'd like to see the context. So that's the long answer, but great question. What else do we have in there? So can you put an if else in the watchdog, which I think means a trigger, or do you need an individual trigger action process for each thing you want to do? So I think this relates to building in logic to our workspaces and automations, making them smarter and accounting for different events. So this is a question from Charles, and we also had one in our question panel about building conditionals. So those two I think are related. So let's chat about those. We do have the filter action in automations. So we can use sort of a contains style statement. So we can filter for different values coming in from our triggers. So what those values are, if it's a directory watch, maybe we're just looking for certain files or file types or things like that. We can build that into the filter action. That's a simple way to do it within the automation using actions. If you want to build more complex conditionals, because conditionals can become quite complex quickly, we can use a workspace as a filter. So for example, if I wanted to build multiple sets of conditionals, I would probably just build a workspace that does that for me, and we can feed the parameters into that workspace and then do all the filtering we need in there. And within a workspace, yeah, you can use regex, you can use our conditional statement builder and test values and make sure they're all good before deploying. So that would be the most sort of granular way of building conditionals. So that's a good question as well. Thank you, Charles. Yeah, and just looking at other questions that we have coming in after. Okay, we have got a good one that I want to bring up. It's kind of specific. We have one asking, can automations monitor a directory in ArcGIS Online and trigger a workspace to run? So I want to highlight this, for one, because ArcGIS Online integrations are really common. I know a lot of you are using them. And for two, because we just did a webinar, I think last week, on ArcGIS Online webhooks. So if you're interested in learning how to use webhooks with FME Server, please go back into our on-demand archive for our webinars and review that webinar. We have a few tutorials for using webhooks in ArcGIS Online. One is for Survey 123, and the second is for using feature service webhooks. And what a webhook can do, as we kind of briefly talked about during this webinar, is send real-time updates to FME Server. So let's say somebody updates a point or maybe attaches a photo to a point or feature in ArcGIS Online, we can send an instant update to FME Server. The other way we can do that, of course, is to use a schedule trigger and regularly pull that folder or feature service in ArcGIS Online and use change detection within that workspace to catch any updates or edits. And of course, yeah, we can run a workspace with those alerts or events after the fact. So that's a really good question. Yeah, and we have some other questions here too, with different requests for features that may not already be in automations. For example, Philip's asking if we thought of adding a cache feature in automation similar to Workbench. And I don't know if that's on our roadmap. I can't say for sure, I'm not in development. But I know it doesn't already exist. And the first place I would look is the FME website, so safe.com, and go to our ideas page. And I would do a quick search and see, feature cache automations and see if somebody has suggested this before. If they haven't, I highly encourage you to submit a new idea for this feature, because our development team is always looking at ideas that are submitted. Because you guys are the users, and you know it would be useful. And I think that's a great idea. So highly encourage you to submit that idea for us to look at again. And yeah, what else do we have here? Great questions. Yeah, okay. Here's another one, just asking, can we monitor multiple directories? And I just wanted to highlight that since we chatted about the directory watch during the webinar. So the answer to that question is yes. We can monitor a directory and its subfolders and subdirectories within that. So you do have to use one directory watch trigger and monitor multiple directories. You do have to have a parent directory, and then you can watch everything within that parent directory for changes. The specific functionality to enter multiple directories into one trigger is not possible, but you could add multiple directory watch triggers to one automation and do it that way. So there's a workaround. Yeah, and there was a question here. I did answer it, but I want to kind of expand on it. Ronnie was asking, how do you add the number of updates, so writers, maybe feature count, that took place within a translation and send it to yourself in an email? I'm a really big fan of notifications, whether it's for errors or summaries or just knowing what's going on. Because even though automations, you can just turn it on and leave it, it's nice to know kind of the health of the automation and the data and all of those things. So I suggested that you can replace your sort of traditional writer in your workspace with a feature writer. And the great thing about a feature writer is that it outputs a summary of everything that it writes. It functions in every way like a feature or like a traditional writer, but you get these summary statistics output from the transformer, and you can also attach downstream actions after you've written those data sets or features. So what I would do is replace my traditional writer with a feature writer, and then I would attach that automations writer to the summary port, and you can get a total feature count sent to your automation. Of course, you can pass that summary attribute into an email action after and send yourself, this automation or this job has written 54 features successfully, and let yourself know exactly what happened during that translation. I also want to highlight the split merge block. Now, that's something we did not cover in this webinar because it's a bit more advanced, but it's a new automation action in FME, I think 2021 it came out. But it's really cool because you can combine actions from multiple combine messages from multiple automation actions. So if you have 5 different workspaces running and you want to send yourself just one email about everything that happened within that automation, you can use the split merge block to combine those messages and send yourself an email. So I'm just going to post the tutorial for that in the chat in case you're interested. Yeah. Great questions, everyone. Just asking if the filter action is still available in FME Server 2022. To my knowledge, it is. If it's gone away, I apologize, but I think it should still be there. To find it, you need to just add an internal action to your canvas, and it should be an option alongside running a workspace and logging a message and things like that. Yeah, a request for automation email external actions using a template. I know this has been requested before. I assume by template you mean the specific connection information for your email address, because we do have templates for Gmail, Outlook, and different email servers in there, but it's just sort of the generic connection information. It doesn't include your passwords and email address. There's not an option yet for saving those connection details like you get in Workbench. I would suggest voting on that idea. I know it does exist in the community, so we can get some more support for that feature. Can we add a trigger through ArcGIS portal? Yes, we don't have a tutorial for it yet, but there is some discussion of that in that ArcGIS online webhooks webinar that I mentioned, and we shared some links for the documentation in Esri for setting those up. It is possible. Just someone asking here, Scott is asking if there's a SharePoint connector. Yes, we do have resources for connecting to SharePoint with FME. I believe we have a tutorial with that. I shared that earlier, but I'll share it again. I know it's a common application that you guys are using, and yes, we can connect to SharePoint from FME Server and Workbench. And yes, we can pass files and synchronize that with Amazon S3, as the question asks. That's definitely a workflow that we could set up with automations. Yeah, I think that really addresses kind of the major questions that we've gotten in here. Thanks everyone for submitting those.
Yeah. So if you do think of any question afterward, just feel welcome to reach out to us via live chat or info@safe.com. And thank you everyone who joined our webinar today, and also to Sanai. Thank you so much. I will leave the webinar open for 5 minutes longer, just in case you have any question or you want to save any links from the chat. And we always love to hear your feedback and how we can improve on our webinars. So please let us know through our survey, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for attending. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, everyone.